All right, this is a lecture on Japan from World War I leading up to the start of World War II. So we're going to start with Japan in World War I was on the Allied side. So they were on the side of the US, Britain, France, etc. So they were on the winning side. As a result, they gained some German colonies after the war. They replaced European countries in some Asian markets. Japanese workers made higher wages, but they also faced high inflation. The price of rice increased 174% between 1914 and 1920. In 1920, Japan joined the League of Nations, and they also began participating in the naval conferences that the U.S. organized and agreed to have only 60% as many warships as the United States. So again, this was a time period of the world trying to figure out how to prevent another war. People were signing treaties saying they would limit their armies and navies, that they would not get involved in conflicts, and Japan agreed to all of this. However, problems began to develop, like a massive earthquake in 1923 that destroyed more than half of Tokyo. It left 2.5 million people homeless, and caused about $1 billion in damages. More than 300,000 people were killed, so it's going to cause a lot of problems, again in 1923. And then during the 1920s, a serious conflict involving the military started to develop within Japanese society. So we start to see younger military officers having problems with the government. And then the next slide kind of outlines what some of the issues were. So the military leaders typically wanted a larger army and larger military budget. They wanted a greater presence in Korea and Manchuria, so they wanted Japan to expand the empire. And they typically wanted more warships and signs of traditional military power. So again, building up the Navy, having those big battleships. Whereas the government leaders, and again, this is a democratic parliament, so people had been elected to parliament in Japan. This is not necessarily the emperor. So the government leaders wanted a smaller army and smaller military budget. Again, the rest of the world was trying to minimize their armies. They wanted fewer troops in Manchuria, so they did not want to expand the Japanese empire in a way that the military wanted. And the government leaders wanted more emphasis on new technology, so submarines, planes, etc., all that stuff that's kind of new in between World War I and World War II. And we have a map, again, showing how Japan was increasingly invading Korea and the northern part of China, which is Manchuria. And as a result, many of the younger Japanese officers lost respect for the government and they started to become openly rebellious. And again, later we're going to talk about some of the assassinations that took place where young military officers would just assassinate politicians that they didn't agree with, etc., etc. And then, of course, in 1929, the Great Depression happens in the United States, and that has serious ramifications for the rest of the world, including Japan. So we're going to have a number of devastating effects. First, Japanese businesses could not sell enough goods on international markets because of high tariffs and the depression in other countries. For example, they made a lot of profit off of selling silk, but in the United States, for example, people are not really going to want to buy silk. It's a luxury that they don't need, and when they can't afford it themselves, they're not going to buy it. Also, for example, the U.S. government put high tariffs on goods coming into the United States, so that ends up hurting Japanese businesses as well as the U.S. economy. Another devastating effect is that banks could not pay out all of the money people had deposited. Unemployment rose, which meant Japanese people couldn't buy a lot either. Prices for farm products fell because most people did not have much money to spend. There was an increase in anti-business sentiments or feelings. People thought that big businesses were profiting at the expense of everyone else. Out-of-work people went back to their home villages, but there wasn't any work there either. Landlords tried to expel some of their tenants so that they could give their own unemployed relatives jobs in the farms. And in northern Japan, the crops failed. So we start to see some issues happening where, as a result of all of these problems, many Japanese people, especially some of the younger army officers, began to have very extreme political views. They resented the prosperity of a few wealthy business owners. They resented foreign influence in Japan. They thought corrupt politicians were responsible for Japan's problems. And ultimately, their goal, they had two goals. Their goal was to have a rich and powerful Japan based on military strength. And they wanted Japan to be the leader of Asia and for the colonial powers to give up their lands. Again, colonial powers like Britain, France, giving up their lands in Asia. Finally, kind of the big one is they thought corrupt politicians... back up. So to achieve these goals, they joined patriotic societies. So all of these young military officers and Japanese who had these extremist views joined patriotic societies like the Sakurai, which was the cherry blossom, and the Black Dragon. And again, these are the groups that are going to assassinate politicians later. So we start to see Japan become more involved in Manchuria. Again, they've already controlled Korea for a while. It's been a territory. Many of these young Japanese officers decided that it would be good to take over Manchuria because of its resources, such as coal, iron, and oil. Again, these are kind of necessary if you want to be a big military power. They were also interested in the soybeans and tobacco. A lot of people were starving, and soybeans would be good for that. And there were Japanese-owned silk and cotton factories as well in Manchuria. So they had an interest in Manchuria. And in 1931, Japanese troops led by these officers attacked Manchuria and forced out the Chinese, even though they did not have orders from the Japanese government to attack. So the emperor and his government did not order this attack. This is military officers acting out of line on their own. Again, they planted some bombs and fake ambushes to convince the world that this was all in self-defense, that the Chinese rebels were attacking them, when really they were trying to instigate a war. Now, when it looked like the League of Nations might criticize this unprovoked attack by one member against another, Japan resigned from the League of Nations. They set up a puppet government in Manchuria, led by the last Chinese emperor, Henry Puyi. Again, that's Henry Puyi, spelled P-U-Y-I. And they called this new country Manchukuo. We also started to see a rise in political extremists, again, kind of similar to Germany and Italy. Between 1932 and 1936, there was a series of political assassinations. The young officers killed a prime minister who wanted to cut military spending, as well as cabinet members, former cabinet members, and prominent businessmen. Although they were caught, tried, and executed, many people viewed the young officers as heroes. So it kind of puts the government in an awkward place where they can't really punish the military for acting out of line because the rest of Japan sees them as heroes. And this kind of sets Japan on a road to war. The military takes over the government. Parliament seems powerless, and most of the tax revenues went to the military. In 1936, Japan signed an alliance with Germany. In July 1937, Japan attacked China. The attack was unplanned and was not supposed to lead to war, but it did.